The amount of bears and ice in my Kislev roster is too dang high. Or is it? I don't know. Let's talk about it, shall we? It's been a major point of discussion over the last couple weeks, one that we touched on a little bit in my Kislev reveal video, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth here just because I think it's a really interesting topic that kind of sits at the core of the pulpy goodness that is Warhammer Fantasy Battle. When does a faction become too mystical, too mythical, too magical, too over the top in a setting that prides itself on doing just that? Well, we find ourselves in a unique situation where reactions to the Kislev reveal were probably not as unanimously hype as Games Workshop or Creative Assembly would have liked. It's hardly a disastrous situation. I don't think they're super worried about it, and I don't want to overstate it because it's really not a massive deal, but essentially we've seen a bunch of bear-themed units and ice-themed units and ice-bear-themed units that comprise a huge chunk of the roster so far, and reaction to that has kind of been split. On the one hand, we've got people saying this is quintessential Warhammer. This isn't really a departure when it comes to design philosophy from CA or GW. They want cool units, they want over-the-top stuff, they want to be blown away by crazy-looking monsters, and they don't want to feel like they're playing a historical Total War faction. The other side wants Kislev to be that gritty, grinded-out faction just barely holding out against the Chaos Gods. They want a heavier emphasis on humans and their struggle. They want the magic and the flashy designs to be kept to an appropriate minimum, to be kept rare. And neither side is wrong. Let me just be clear about that. I think we all have our own vision for what a Kislev or Cathay might look like. We've been thinking about these things for a long time now, and if those expectations aren't met, it's natural to feel some dissonance and want to share your opinion on the topic. Same holds true for the other side. And for the people who wanted a gritty, human-focused Kislev, the main arguments have lasered in on Flanderization, which, as we explained previously, is the act of taking a single trait within a faction and exaggerating that element more and more over time until it completely consumes the character or identity of the topic at hand. Essentially, the trait is so outlandish and garish that it becomes their defining characteristic and permeates every section of the unit roster, which in this case refers to ice and bears. Bears and ice. Now, the bear sleds and Little Grom have been the main focus of this debate, and I think a lot of good criticism has been made about them. In previously established Kislevite lore, even though this is the kingdom of the bear where Ursun is the primary deity, relationships with bears are quite rare. In fact, they're so rare that the relationship between Tsar Boris and his companion Erskine is considered exceptional. It's considered unique. So I don't think anyone has a problem with bear cavalry existing. I think we can all get on board with the fact that winged hussars riding bears is freaking cool. It's awesome. It should have existed sooner. And that they were a logical next step for Kislev to take them into that age of 8th edition. But once you start adding in 4 or 5 separate mid to high tier variants of bear cav and bear sleds and use bears as draft animals meant to pull your merry sleighs to the snowy drifts of the Oblast, it takes away some of that unique relationship that Boris had with Erskine. A relationship that had many questioning if they were some kind of spiritual unity, a mortal representative of their god. When the entire cavalry contingent of a Kislevite army is comprised of bear and bear accessories, perhaps it has gone overboard. And a similar complaint has been levied towards this magical ice element that appears to be adorning many units and their mounts. The Ice Queen Katerin is boarding around like she's the Silver Surfer, the Griffin Legion have icicle ornaments spiking off the top of their mounts, and many of the draft units are sliding around on a bed of teal, opaque, shiny frieze. Now, this one is entirely up to personal preference. I think that the bed of ice on the Little Grom and bear sleds is a bit garish, and could probably use some tweaking, but as others have rightfully pointed out, it is logical for the more elite units of Kislev to have closer ties to Ursun and the Ancient Widow, and to channel their power and imagery. So the more elite we get, the more mystical we'll get, the more ice and bears we will see. And in trailers and cinematics and full-on reveals, obviously, the crazier, more over-the-top stuff will get highlighted over the burly Russians in Ushankas. A massive ice bear punching a greater demon in the mouth will catch someone's eye a lot better than a dude with an axe and a musket, so naturally we'll be seeing them more in the trailers. And ultimately, Games Workshop is trying to sell models here, so adding more monstrous fantasy stuff was an inevitability. But that doesn't mean you have to like it. And I think to fully understand this discussion, we need to put it in context. We need to look at some of the other races in Warhammer Fantasy Battle and think about the reaction towards them when they were first announced. You weren't seeing many complaints about Flanderization when the Tomb Kings trailer dropped. You weren't seeing these arguments when the Lizardmen were announced. You almost never hear about it with the Skaven. Why is that? The Tomb Kings have a full-on, over-the-top Egyptian aesthetic that permeates every single portion of their unit roster. Their 500-ton marble statue, Necrosphinx, levitates around the deserts of Nehekara like it's Mary Poppins, y'all. All their constructs are powered by souls and magic. Their very existence as a faction is built on the foundation of a potentially world-consuming spell engineered by Nagash. The Lizardmen are Mesoamerican dinosaurs with space laser technology and floating temple cities, and those elements permeate every portion of their unit roster too. No one complains that those factions are too Age of Sigmar-esque, that they're too fantasy. And the same can be said for the Skaven, which are ridiculous to the point of comedy. A race of technologically advanced ratmen with Gatling guns, flamethrowers, and goddamn nuclear weapons, who snort warpstone, eat warpstone, use warpstone ammunition, and buy and trade for it like currency. Warpstone is present on huge sections of their roster. It turns their monsters into hellish freaks. It allows them to mold flesh like Dr. Frankenstein. It drives their economy, and in fact, it even looks like the ice we see for Kislev. The simple truth of the matter is that we don't often hear complaints about them because those races were well established in Warhammer Fantasy Battle lore, while Kislev, at least up to this point, has not been. The modern unit rosters for the Tomb Kings and Lizardmen and Skaven have been around for more than a decade. The modern unit roster for Kislev has been around for 2 weeks. That is the biggest difference. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with being critical of the design philosophy behind Kislev. If you don't like it, you don't like it. There are certainly things that I don't like about it too. There have been tons of good points made about the garishness of the ice, of the over-reliance on bear and ice motifs, and bear units and ice units, and bear this and ice that, and bear all, whatever. Those are all legitimate criticisms. And I think both Games Workshop and Creative Assembly would be right to heed them. I think there are elements that they could tone down and make most people, or at least, yeah, I'd say most people happy on that front. But on the flip side, not even talking about Warhammer here, just talking about in general, in life, people can kind of be resistant to change and the new kid on the block. So while they might be willing to ignore these themes in older, more established factions, it feels a lot more prominent and in your face when the marketing cycle for a new game is kicking into overdrive. And so there's that dissonance between what people were expecting with a very grounded, human-focused Kislev roster and the more mystical and fantastical roster we've seen thus far. But that's the thing, we still don't have the full unit roster yet. We don't know how their armies will actually be constructed or how useful their mainline human troops will be. If the bears are simply better than everything and end up overshadowing all the normal units in a way that makes people not want to use Kossars, Streltsy, Wing Lancers, and so on, then yeah, we have a problem. But it really depends how their roster is constructed and if Creative Assembly takes any steps to curb doomstacking and single entity spam when Warhammer 3's campaign finally rolls around. There's an important design philosophy in video games that a lot of developers subscribe to, and that given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of any game. That they'll find a tactic that works really well, and even if it literally leads to less enjoyment on their end, they'll still do it because it makes it easier to win. Because they know it's more efficient, it's more effective, they can min-max something, and once they figure that out, they can't go back to playing normally. There's plenty of evidence that points to that in our community. It's not true for everyone, of course, but there's definitely a kernel of truth there. So you can say, just let people play how they want, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but as a dev that's making massive unit rosters with tons of variety, you obviously want to encourage players to use everything in their arsenal. So while Creative Assembly shouldn't actively prevent players from doomstacking with 20 Bloodthirsters or 20 Bear Cav or 20 Ice Elementals of Ursun, it should be optional at the very worst, options like unit caps and the like. They should do things to encourage players to bring balanced army compositions through economic changes, through the wound system, through alteration to the recruitment pool that makes spamming the same unit over and over a less attractive proposition. These are things that we don't know yet if Creative Assembly have tackled, so while the Ice and the Bears are clearly front and center in the marketing of Kislev so far, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how they're going to look and play on the battlefields of Total War Warhammer 3. Ultimately, without question, Kislev is being Flanderized here. Those magical elements are being turned up to 11 all across the board. And if people don't like that design philosophy, they are right to voice their opinion. Because I think there are parts that can be improved, and CA is typically receptive to feedback on stuff like this. The thing we need to understand, though, is that this is not new in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. We can go through the list of existing factions and see similar themes become Flanderized there as well. We don't play this series for subtlety and nuance. We have units called Skull Crushers and Bloodthirsters. It's a pulpy, ridiculous, over-the-top mess, and that's why we love it. So while I don't begrudge anyone for preferring a more grounded, less fantastical Kislev, this isn't some massive Age of Sigmar-esque departure from what we already have. And that's all I have to say about that.